I want to thank all of you for coming, first of all. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Kelly Harold, and I'm the Executive Director today of the Buffalo County Historical Society. And in honor of our being 35 years old tomorrow, actually, is the actual 35th birthday for the Historical Society, we decided to have Michael William Doyle come back. He was the first Executive Director for the Society.
But not the best.
Well, of course. We can go on and on about that. So he's coming back, and he's going to share with you some of the stuff that he did when he first started and when the Society was in its infancy. And he's also going to share with you some of the changes he's seen happen over the years, because he's continued to be involved in some way, whether as a member or whatever, ever since he was the director. And then at the end of his talk, I'll give you guys a little bit of a spiel about what we're doing today that maybe he hasn't been able to cover on his own. So otherwise, thank you, and welcome Michael to the stage.
Thank you very much. This is a great joy for me to be here. This is a homecoming for us. I was surprised when Kelly emailed me just almost a year ago to ask if I would be available to do this. We're putting together the programming for this, the 35th year, because he said that the Society's birthday was going to be dated from October 18th, 1980. And the reason why that struck me as odd is that was a Saturday. Why do I know? Because on October 18th, 1980, my wife, Eleanor Johnson, and I were married on the other fork of Jaeger Valley. And I did help shepherd through the application for this to become an incorporated, not-for-profit 501c3 organization. And I don't think the state works on Saturdays. So I don't know why that would have been the date, but I'm taking your word for it. So here it is, the day before. We've almost made it 35 years. You know, there's still time, right? All right. An explanation about the title here. I've always wanted to try to figure out how to bring together the various threads of my life, personal life, professional life. And it's been very difficult for me to do that because there are people that are here, including my wife's, they call it maid of honor? Maid of honor, whatever it was. Susan Johnson, who's sitting next to her back at this table, who was at that wedding on October 18, 1980. And Sherry Holtzman, who was a member of the farm that we lived on, who was there as well. And Randy McLaughlin, who was at that event, a good friend of mine. And so there was this life of living on a hippie commune that existed independently of the work that I did as a public historian here in Buffalo County. And then those two things existed in a separate sphere from the academic life that I've lived since I left here in 1985, 30 years ago. And so this has been an opportunity for me to try to weave together the threads of these very separate, different parts of my life into what I hope is a coherent whole. But I thought that I was going to have to put countercultural into the title, and I'm hoping by the time I'm done with this presentation today, you'll see how it has more than one meaning. You will notice, and you have to take my word for it, that is me 35 years ago, a wisp of a lad. Today I'm back, 30% more in the same container. More to love. So we were up, I've got a brother who lives in the Twin Cities, Eleanor does as well, and we usually try to get back once a year to have a family gathering up there. And this time we decided on our way back to Indiana, where I live now, to go down the River Road on the Wisconsin side. We haven't done that in a long time. And lo and behold, as we were approaching Nelson, instead of a sign advertising, you know, Nelson's ahead, stop at the creamery, have an ice cream cone, there was this sign. And it struck me that this is the legacy. What I mean by this is if you look at this, I got out and walked through the weeds, tried to get it as close as possible. The sign says Alma on the Mississippi. Well, that's the title of the book that we of the Alma Historical Society published in 1982 as a result of research that I'm going to talk about in the precursor to the founding of the Buffalo County Society. I say 1980, I guess it actually did come out in December of that year. Then the second thing is, you'll notice that black block of text there. It says National Historic District. Well, I got involved in public history work here because of that project. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But what we told people back in the area of the few years following the nation's bicentennial, which was what year? 76. In that year, in the couple of years that followed, the number of historical societies in the state of Wisconsin doubled. There was a great deal of emphasis on connecting the national story with the local story. So people knew about the national past because it's taught in schools. But what you would find out about local history was opaque. It wasn't easily available. Some places had historical societies, but Buffalo County did not one. And so the story is, we pitched this idea that why didn't we found a historical society? Because it would be possible to make this a destination. People would come to Alma and the other river towns because of its great beauty and its history, and that we would find a way to welcome them, and that would help our businesses, so that people could make a living here doing something besides resource exploitation or farming. Nothing wrong with that, but you've got to diversify, right? So when I saw this sign, you would just glance at a roadside and drive on. I said to Eleanor, stop, because there it is. It's the proof. It worked. They bought the vision. We did it, and it's still here.
Oh, good.
So there's two parts to the story. You've invited me here to talk about the origins of the Buffalo County Historical Society, and I will get to that. But I am a historian, and so I've got to give you the backstory. So yes, it was organized beginning in the fall of 1980. Initially, we shared a space in the office that the City Hall, which was a former Buffalo County Teachers College, had given over the use of the upstairs, and one office there, to the Alma Historical Society was founded. Today, of course, it's in the courthouse in a nice office with a research facility there. And then I was hired as the first executive director once funding was secured, largely through the efforts of Judge Gary Schlosstein and other people in the county board and in the city fathers, if we call them that. They were men. And that allowed a position to be created that I applied for and was hired. So it was really these 2 years, the end part of 1980, as we conceived the idea of a county historical society as the natural outgrowth of the City Historical Society, Alma. And then up to the point where our daughter was born and I got a job full-time as the rural mail carrier on Route 1 Fountain City, which, as you know, is a 6-day-a-week job. And it wasn't possible to then work 3 days on top of that and have a family that would stay intact for very long. So, the countercultural roots. This talk is kind of broken into these two parts about the autobiography, in which I will talk about my life in the 60s counterculture, and then to talk about what I call biography, which is the biography of this organization that we're celebrating the 35th anniversary of. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this term, because it's thrown around a lot, and usually it obscures more than it actually communicates. Counterculture is a term that actually emerges in the 1960s to try to explain what was largely referred to as hippies that were dropping out of mainstream society, and it was a little vague besides sex, drugs, and rock and roll, what that rebellion was all about. I'm now a historian, and because I came late into the life of the academy, I had to find a subject that I actually knew something about, that I could get a dissertation done and out on the job market pretty rapidly. And so it fell to me to decide, well, you know what? I'm old enough now that I could write about the history that I lived through, the recent past, because there isn't a literature on it. And since I know something about this, and a lot of people are interested in it, why not do that as my subject? But once I started researching it, I found out how really messy it is. Because, for example, social movements have leaders. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the people who led the Civil Rights Movement. They have agendas, they have organizations that sell memberships. You can track their progress institutionally. You can see legislation that comes about as an outgrowth of this, the women's movement. Think about this. But the counterculture was anti-political. It wasn't interested in getting people elected to Congress. They didn't want people on the school board. They wanted to start alternative school systems. They wanted to reform the culture. The politics would follow. So with that as kind of my hook, I'm going to make an argument in this talk that the Buffalo County Historical Society, at least the thing that I got in and interested in, grew out of my interest in countering what I consider the more pernicious parts of American culture in the wake of the 60s. So that's where I'm going with this talk. Let's kick it off. Here's where we should cue the music. All right, so I was looking for images, and this has been fascinating to conduct research in my own personal archive, and also have friends that were paying attention to those days, some of whom took pictures. This is the first time I've ever tried to pull all this together. That's me in the left here with my drum set in my bedroom in Winona, 720 Main Street. The reason the drums are in my bedroom on the second floor is that there's a flood, and everything that was in the basement had to come upstairs, and this was very unpopular with my family because my brother was on one side, my parents were on the other, and here I am, Ringo Starr, desperately trying to grow my hair out, and it's growing very slowly. So he said, well, you got a real horse manure in there. While I was in high school, I ran a head shop, that's what they called them at the time, the Goat Farm. It was where Buck's Candy, he made his own anise down by the 2 movie theaters. It's now no longer there because the Winona County Historical Society and the old armory has expanded into that. That was next to the Clark gas station, you know, the Winona in the old days. Eventually my hair grew out. I graduated and gave a commencement address at Winona Senior High School, 71. My dad lent me the money to start this poster shop in hopes that it would keep me away from having anything to do with drugs. So instead I sold pipes and black lights and posters so that I could stay away from drugs and the other people could buy this stuff. He said, what are these things? I said, well, it's called a hookah, Dad. I don't know, the college kids, it's a craze. I went to the Chicago Democratic Convention. My parents did not know. I was 15. I went down there because they said they were going to bring the Haight-Ashbury to Lincoln Park, and I just had to be there for that. So I told my parents I'm going out on the river on a sandbar. There are no cell phones. How do I know where you are? You're gone for 3 or 4 days. I had no idea it was going to be a police riot. I thought I'd meet Eugene McCarthy. And I did, and I got a little button that said, Republicans for McCarthy, because my parents were Republicans. And I wore that proudly around the house until my mother ran over it in the driveway on purpose. Fortunately, it was not still on me at the time. So this is June of 71, because I graduated in June of 71. That's June 10th right there. My commencement address was run verbatim in the Winona Daily News. That's how slow of a news day it was. I bought a backpack from LLB, which is, I'd never heard of before, and I hit the road 2 weeks later on the new interstate highway system that allowed me to spend a couple of years just seeing America. Remember? See America first. I hadn't seen anything, so that's what I wanted to do. I also got involved in historic preservation and community organizing, and part of the deal was Winona County's courthouse is one of the most exquisite anywhere. And that came within a whisper of being destroyed because the people who worked there said it was too cramped and out of date, and it would be easier to just knock the thing down and build a modern courthouse, which would show how progressive we were. That was historic preservation's main challenge in the 60s under urban renewal, if you knew about that program. So as a high school student, I got involved in the effort to save the Winona County Courthouse, and miracle of miracles, it worked! We saved it. But we then formed a historic preservation organization, a couple of friends of mine and some stand-up citizens who actually had power in society in Winona those days, and decided we should formalize this, not just be one building at a time, but see if we could do something in Winona that would get people to recognize what was there. And so this became how I got into local history, was to save the built environment where the memories in here for people. When I come back here and see what's still here, the memories come flooding back. So memories adhere in a particular way to the material world. They become kind of like our memory banks, external to our own brain. That's my thesis. Well, we did not succeed in saving the Morgan block. They had to knock that down for new development. It basically sat there and the wind blew the sand around when it was a sandbar until eventually they did get kind of a development. It's an ugly eyesore that has always been very difficult to develop. And Winona looks back at this exquisite block that was knocked down just because it was old, and that was part of the turning point. The Latch block got saved, and in fact that became the locus of famine foods. I'll get to that in a moment. The other strand from where I got the skill sets to bring to bear for organizing the Historical Society was all this other stuff. So for a time, I did talk about it, but I published an underground newspaper at my high school. The last 2 years I was there. That's what I learned when I was down in Chicago at the convention, was that you could get mimeograph machines and run stuff off, and they couldn't keep you from doing that. So, there was a Students for a Democratic Society group at the Winona State campus for a short period of time. I have a flyer from them. On November 9th, 1969, they called a meeting at 7 p.m. establishment time. Well, then it folded. And I went to find out if they still had their old A.B. Dick mimeograph machine. They said, yeah. And I said, well, is anyone going to use it? No. Can I have it? Yeah. So I took it, and we started this underground newspaper. And then that grew into a newsletter for the Winona Alternatives community, based around famine foods, the food co-op that's now called Bluff Country, which started in '72. I started Lone Pine Press, and we published 4 Winona poets. I'm one of the 4. Started writing for this publication, the North Country Anvil, over in Millville, Minnesota, the Zumbro River. Got hired by the Wisconsin Arts Board to put a publication together called Wisconsin Images. For those of you who go back that far, the WPA, the 1930s, hired unemployed artists and poets and theater people to make a living during the Great Depression. Well, during the economic downturn of the 70s, the Wisconsin Arts Board did something like that. So I was able to work with other poets, writers, photographers, and we published that book. That was the last big thing that I did before I got involved in the Alma Historical Society. And then for 10 years, every 3 months on the equinoxes and solstices at Holtzinger Lodge in Winona, we did an arts poetry reading, film fest, musicians performed, and so I did that for 10 years. So I learned how to run events and do publicity, make posters, and those were skill sets that I brought forth. And then finally, the food co-op movement. This is me with Ellery Foster. I am now, when this picture is taken, in 1974, the first paid employee of Famine Foods. It was an all-volunteer natural foods grocery at that time. We started a farmer's market downtown in the sand lot that the Morgan block had formerly been part of. Started a wholesale grocery so that all of the people who were begun producing organic grains and foods, including Little Bear Flour Mill, we're on the premises here, we gathered all of those foodstuffs, Casty's Orchard, organic apples down by Galesville, and Stockton Roller Mills. And then a truck came down from the Twin Cities with organic foods that we sold at Famine Foods. And then we put these raw foodstuffs up so that the truck had stock on it and took it farther back up to the Twin Cities. And so that we ran that business for a couple of years, and I, among other things, published a newsletter in conjunction with that. So there was a lot of activity of people in Winona that I was involved in. I could never have done any of this by myself. It was always a group effort. And although I don't have a lot of photographs of other people involved in it, that's what was going on. Well, here comes early, mid-70s. I found out that there was an opportunity to live in the town of Montana, Buffalo County, in what I called Owl Hollow. It was adjacent to the Neil and Charlotte Bremer farm, not far from where Hank Bremer's place was. The deal was I could live there rent-free in exchange for feeding cattle on the feedlot there just in the wintertime. When they were put out to pasture in the spring, I could continue to live there, never had to pay a cent of rent. Wood heat, I had a wood lot access, so I was able to live on $1,500 a year. which was easy to earn. Maximum spare time to go figure out how I could plug in and help people. Did a lot of writing, a lot of reading. And that inclined me to say I wanted to live in this place. People ask me, how'd you get involved with all these old people in Buffalo County and you're not even from around here? And I said, well, you know what? Neither were your ancestors. They all came from someplace else here because they wanted to. They loved this place. They weren't born here and never left. They came here because this is an exquisite place to live. And they wanted to live here. That's why I came here. So Jaeger Valley Community Farm, the other fork in the road, that road ended at our place. We bought this from Melvin Blank and his wife in 1975, $39,000. The Salways, our near neighbors, said you paid too much for it. No, we didn't. I looked at 25 farms at that point, and this was a fair price. It wasn't cheap, it wasn't expensive, it was about right. We liked the fact that you had to want to go there. You didn't stumble on this place because you had to know where it was even to find your way back there. So anybody that came back there were coming back there to see us, and that helped. You could see the gravel road cloud about 5 minutes before the car would ever arrive at your house, so you always knew the company was coming. It was organized initially by 4 families. Sherry is sitting there, she was one of them. I was the only one who wasn't married. All of the other couples had children, 3 of which were born that summer of 1975, by midwives here in Trempealeau County, where there was another intentional community farm. And all of us had been involved in some kind of alternative activities, mostly around the food co-op, but there had been people in our group that had been part of the anti-Vietnam War movement, even civil rights activities, free speech. And then in college, George Manlove was at Cornell University when, as a protest against the war in Vietnam, they shut down the university the week of final exams. He walked away and did not get his degree because he didn't take his final exams. And then 30 years later, the Board of Trustees of Cornell University reached out to people that had done everything for the degree but the final exams, and they said, look, all is forgiven. You're a Cornellian. Here's your degree. But that's how people were in those days. 4 years to an education, and you'd say, screw it. I don't want anything to do with this anymore. I'm going into the counterculture, or however you would word it. They dropped out. They just didn't want to go down that path anymore. So we ended up here. This is a composite. It took a while to find all of these because I gave away my camera this year, 75, because I was into Zen. And in Zen, you live in the moment. And if you're all about taking pictures, you're taking an image to look at later, that takes you out of the moment. So I didn't want anything to do with that. Well, it makes it hard when 35 years later, you know, hey, you got any pictures? That's all anybody wants. So this is all of the families. Here are all their names. This picture must have been taken right after we moved out to the place. I was the first one, St. Michael's Day, 1975, September 29th. And then in the ensuing weeks, everybody else moved out. This is the only picture I know of all of us in one time. You can see the kids are, you know, infants. And then the Bizant's family joined us as the 5th family after about the first year, if I remember correctly. So now this is the transition from my life in the counterculture to the biography of the organization. And this is something that I don't know that anybody knows this story. I know it, but I was talking to Eleanor about this, and she said, well, I didn't know that about you, and I was living with you in those days. Well, this is a story. There was a consortium of power plants, Dairyland Power prominently among them, a cooperative, Northern States Power, a for-profit public utility, and they decided it was time for them to get into the nuclear power industry. It's clean fuel, as people were saying at that time. Even President Obama is in favor of us getting back into nuclear power as an all-above solution. But there was a great deal of bias among people in the alternatives counterculture area against this. Because for one, we still, to this day, do not have a way of permanently dealing with the waste from these plants. So Red Wing, we've got 2 people here from Red Wing today. The waste fuel is kept in sight, and it's not protected against terrorists. They don't have the resources. It sits there until there's a national solution. We still don't have one. So, you know, the thing of it is, they were going to build this at a place called Tyrone, near Durand, and it meant that it had to have an environmental impact statement. That was part of the EPA's requirement. EPA's brand new, signed into law under Richard Nixon. And I discovered that part of this was you had to comment on potential adverse impacts on cultural resources if you wanted to build a nuclear power plant, or really any kind of power plant. So I thought, well, what does that mean, cultural resources? And I looked into it, and they said it would be like not-for-profit organizations like museums and historical societies. And I thought, aha, all right. Well, I'll find out who's doing that in Buffalo County, and I'll see if they might not want to get involved. Well, there wasn't any. And I mean, this struck me as absolutely bizarre. Buffalo County is 700 square miles. 14,000 people in late 70s, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, and 28,000 dairy cattle. So we were outnumbered. We had to do something. No, but I mean, think about that. I was struck during the time I was living in Owl Hollow and was going all up and down every road and dugway I could. I just loved, tooling around in this place in my old truck. I was struck by how when I pulled the books on the history of Buffalo County, and they were largely biographical of the original settlers and then the people that were alive in the late 19th century when the books were published, they were still there. People who had come here in the 1850s, when there still were Native Americans living in Buffalo County, these people came, they built for the ages. They farmed the soil and they persisted, and their children stayed. And I was struck by how the United States of America has produced a civilization that's footloose and fancy-free. We pick up and we go. Jack Kerouac, the beat writer, once said, well, it's because of how the rotation of the earth goes that anyone who's not tied down rolls west. But in Buffalo County, people came and they stayed. So that made me very interested in, well, I don't know whether you know, but this house where's the house? Right over here? That's a log house, the old Cochrane place. The deep window wells, so strip the siding off, that's a log structure, and as far as I know, it's still being lived in. It was being lived in when we were in this village. And the old Jaeger place. What are the stories? Well, there weren't any stories. If there were going to be stories, you're going to have to go and find them out and bring them together. So my part of this was, let's found a not-for-profit organization that would then have a seat at the table, a commentary about possible adverse impacts of what I consider to be this totally superfluous and unnecessary power plant at Tyrone proposed, and then see what we could do about providing alternatives to that. Well, it so happened that there was an architectural historian who came to Alma because he loved looking at old 19th century rivertown architecture. He taught at the University of Wisconsin, named Gordon Orr, and he stopped in at John and Joanne Runyon's Riverside Gallery. John's exquisite watercolorist. He made me sit for this portrait. I didn't have time to sit for a portrait. I had a historical society to organize. But, so I humored him. And then my parents came to visit, and they saw this in his shop. I wasn't going to buy it. Why would I want a picture of myself? I could look in the mirror. But my parents bought it. So 2 years ago, when we moved them from their home in upstate New York to be close to us in Muncie, in their 90s, they didn't have room for this, so I inherited this portrait that I did not want. So today, there's what I look like, at least in one artist's imagination. So what came of this discussion was Gordon Orr said to the Runyons, you have a river town that is intact. Obviously, almost everything that was here in the last 3 decades of the 19th century is still here, and it's as good as it was the day it was built, almost. All of those stone retaining walls and steps, they still work. Because the German Swiss that quarried that rock from the bluffs, they built for the ages. They didn't just come here because this was a way station on their way west. They came here to build a civilization and a good life, and they stayed, and they were good to their word. So his point was, if you only know this and live here, you take it for granted. But you could go out to America and watch the malls eating up the farmscape, and what they're building is not for the ages. It's for the bottom line, and who cares what it looks like in 30 years? They'll knock it down. So why don't you do something with what you've got here? You don't realize what a jewel you have right here in the Mississippi. And so I said, you know what? I can help with that. I'm a community organizer. So we started meeting, and I went down to the Wisconsin Historical Society, then known as the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, and asked around, found out that there was an Office of Local History Services, and through them learned that these people who work for the State Historical Society are at your disposal as a tax-paying citizen of Indiana. Well, I thought, great, we need help. Help us. So they did. They sent David Donath up, who was an architectural historian, and he helped to produce a survey. The Office of Local History Services says, you don't need a lawyer. You want to become a not-for-profit? We can do the deal. It'll take us about 3 weeks. Let's get started. So we got officers, we got the thing launched, and by early '78, we had our first public meeting, sold memberships, and said, let's do a historic survey of Elma and get all these properties nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. That shouldn't be too hard. So basically, David Donath walked around and he did a sketch. This is the sketch. He identified, I'll put this next one, whoops, okay, I get a little bit ahead of myself. I'm going to get to this, this is scanned and up. Basically, you spent a couple of days in town, and you know, they didn't have Google Maps like that, so you just drew this from your eyeball and from any maps you could find. And he helped to identify structures based on 3 categories, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Where I was going with this as the interim was that when we had this second meeting in late summer, August 15th, '78, the decision was, let's go with this. And in fact, there's a limit to what you can do with volunteers. What we need to do is to find some money and hire somebody. So I started making inquiries and found out that there was a community action program that was kind of an outgrowth of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, War on Poverty initiatives. And every state had regions, and every region had an office. And that office was granted money from the feds, and they had to follow guidelines in that. Ours for this region was over in Whitehall. And I went over there and I said, we're a not-for-profit. Is there any way we could get money to hire staff that could do this project? And they said, that's exactly what we're looking for, is people in a community who want to do good works that there's no money for otherwise. We can help you do that. And notice, this is in the aftermath of the nation's bicentennial. How does the nation's history connect to the history at the grassroots level? This would be a way that connected the two. So we got the money, put an ad in the paper, board of directors interviewed people. I got hired. Wasn't a done deal, other people applied. Barbara Anderson-Sanis was hired as the assistant historian, and we got to work. This is David Donath's slide. You can't probably see it too well here, but I've got enlargements. In the upper left is one of the 2 bird's eye views that were done in the 19th century that show Elma. This was extraordinarily helpful, because I don't know if you have ever looked closely at this. Did I bring my copy? I didn't. This is so accurate that if they said that there was a tier of 3 windows on the 3rd level of a building, and there's only 2 there today, if you got up close, you could see where they bricked in the 3rd. So detail down to that level, placement, and they didn't do this by photographs. Notice the angle. There weren't airplanes. They did not go up on a hot air balloon. How do I know that? Because the Buffalo County newspaper actually ran an article on the artists when they were in town, and they were doing this. So this was a projection from them walking around doing the same thing that David Donath did 100 years later. So I found the resources that were available, and with this, we discovered through David's system that there were buildings that were called pivotal. Those would go on the National Register no matter what. Contributing, they were historic structures, maybe modified in some ways. On their own, they wouldn't be considered architecturally worthy, or unless you could prove that the history that had happened in them was meritorious on the national level, it wouldn't go on the National Register. And then there were buildings that were called intrusions. We never used that around the business owners or the residential property owners, but what it meant was those would not be eligible to be in a historic district, which has to be a collection of structures that are related to one another. And the collection here is the built environment of Elma, buildings that were in existence before 1930. Because a building had to be 50 years old or older to qualify. Why the gap? Well, how do we know in 50 years what will be important to future generations? The oldest McDonald's hamburger stands are now being listed on the National Register because we are a fast food society. And if you want to know about the obesity rates, you should preserve the architecture that was part of how we got those calories into our bodies. And that's been more than 50 years now. So we are trying to preserve some of those to show when those came into our culture and what the consequences were. That's kind of fascinating to think of. Shopping malls will be next. So yes, we went through and went to every one of the structures that were considered pivotal or contributing, read every issue of the Buffalo County newspaper that was made available to us in bound volumes. We spent months doing that, taking notes. We went to the courthouse and went through tax records so that we could say that there was a lot described by its section within the legal framework. Forget the language, it's not coming to mind. But the taxation on it in 1 year would jump from maybe $10 to $150. You knew that if there was not a general overall reassessment, that lot had been improved. Then you would go to the newspaper and look very closely in that year, and the editor would have commented that they put up a new structure there. That was the proof of the date of construction. It took hundreds and hundreds of hours, but that's what we did. In all, there were 35 pivotal structures. All of those ended up on the National Register, and 216 that were considered contributing, and those all went together into our National Register nomination, which there were a total of 134 properties. I should mention that one of them that we wanted to include, the feds wouldn't allow us to, and that was Lock and Dam number 4, which had been built during the Great Depression. It was old enough, but the Army Corps of Engineers who own and operate it said they did not want it designated as a historic structure because that might mean that they couldn't modify it, which actually was untrue, but try telling them that. Anyway, while we were doing this and gathering up this incredible information, Orland Brother Dave Bouch was just saying that 2 weeks ago he gave an illustrated lecture on the historic architecture of Alma, and he relied on this book for his facts, and people thought he was brilliant. So what are you going to do with all this information, people said? Well, you said we're going to nominate to the National Register. Well, what the heck is that? And how does that help us? But they wanted the history. They gave us the history. We discovered and created the history that was in documents, but how could we give it back? Well, the logical thing was to do a book. Well, I know how to do books. How hard can that be? So we did a book, and I'll tell you about, while that was going on, I wanted to do some more artsy-fartsy stuff. And I learned that Pooch Deniff had, let's see, do I have that here? Yes. I don't know if Pooch is still around. Delvin was his given name, nobody called him that. He owned the Lucky 7 Tavern in Elma. He also owned the old Sherman House. And he had kind of a museum collection there. It wasn't open necessarily regular hours and that. And he wasn't from around here either. But anyway, he told me that his tavern had once been Gerhard Gazelle's photography studio, and they still had the skylight in the roof that allowed the light from the north to come in so it wasn't glaring, because not having electric lights when he was a photographer, they had to find a way to bring natural light in and then control it with mirrors to get good portrait work done. And that the Historical Society in Madison had come and taken the glass plate negatives and some of the prints when he bought the building. What was he going to do with them? And down to Madison. I thought, wow, photographs, glass plate negatives. This bears looking into. So he also told me that he himself had taken a bunch of these negative plates when they were cleaning out the place, and did like everybody in Elm in those days did. They went down to the river and they threw them in the river. So some of the glass plate negatives are gone forever. Fortunately, some of those had been printed, so we had the prints. So I looked into it and found out that you could get these mini grants, $1,000 from the Wisconsin Humanities Committee, which was the state agency that funneled money from the National Endowment of the Arts, which had its 50th birthday last month, LBJ Great Society program. And I went down there and stayed for several weeks while Barbara was finishing up research for the book and put together a traveling exhibit. Janice Schoen and Roger Schoen, I understand they're still involved, okay, on the board. Dave Bouch, who was here a moment ago, he's selling pumpkins for an event that's going on, couldn't stay. These were folks that helped with the label copy. It takes a village. I didn't do all this myself. Joanne Runyons, with her husband's van, helped us transport this. We got the thing done. George Talbot, who was the head of the Visual and Sound Archives, let us use his garage that he had turned into a workshop to actually build the thing. And then we used David Mandel, the photo archivist for the Wisconsin Historical Society, that actually printed the images, two of which I have here. And this one, taken from the sandbar that's directly across from Alma, depicts Gerhard Gazelle's own children posed after a very famous photograph that was painted by an artist on the Rhine River, which is where Gerhard Gazelle came from. So he recreated this landscape photo here in the New World using his own family, and I'm bringing this to present to the Buffalo County Historical Society so that you'll have something to hang in the office to remember. If you flip that around, I actually give you the glass plate negative number in case anyone wants prints. So we got this thing done. It premiered at the Buffalo County Fair. In 1979, we decided that we needed to be out there, not just in Alma, but be out there in the rest of the county. The place to do that was the county fair. I understand now the Buffalo County Historical Society has its own room for educational programming out there, and that I'm assuming the Mondovi Historical Society, Alma, you get together and kind of collaborate to...
We have at times.
Okay.
Mondovi has their own little booth in the
Yes, they do.
commercial building, so.
Okay. So anyway, programming at the fair, this was the first thing that we did. And by the late winter, we finished the research on the multiple resource nomination, as it was called. That's a district and other associated properties. It was a new category for the National Register. Ours was the first in the state of Wisconsin, so, you know, who knew that? And that had been sent off, so it took until 1982, that's the connection to that date, until it was approved at the federal level. So today it's on the sign, you got bragging rights to that. Barbara got this idea that in doing the research that she found that the people that come from Switzerland used to have August 1st, which I think is Swiss Independence Days, okay, and they used to build a big bonfire on top of the bluff so that all of the steamboats could see it. You could see it from the Minnesota side of the river, announcing that the Swiss were here, and they were proud of it. So she conceived the idea of a Swiss Heritage Days, and the first one that was held in 1981 in the aftermath of the research for the nomination, the book that came out, and now the great revival of interest in local history. Does that still go on? Swiss Heritage Days?
It was not for a while,
Okay.
and a local businessman in, he's not originally from Alma, but
Okay.
he kind of redid it like 2 years ago. Swiss Heritage Days.
So it's not annual, but
But it is,
it's still
annual
that.
now.
Oh, it is
but
annual. Okay, so there's some
I think it's
persistence.
the beginning of August.
The book came out then in December of 1980. We printed 1,000 copies. This was kind of gutsy. I did all the typesetting, worked with a typesetting person. I edited the manuscript. We took it through 2 drafts. I ran it over to St. Mary's College Press, and they were the ones that bound it together. It cost $11.95, $2 off if you ordered in advance. There were 956 people living in Alma when we published 1,000 copies at what was considered to be an expensive price. And they were sold out 1 year later. It won an award of merit from the Wisconsin Council on Local History, which is the 240 historical societies in the state of Wisconsin that gather twice a year, and once a year they issue awards for the best projects that were done in a variety of categories. So we got the best book that year. And this is what it looks like, and I've got a copy here. If some of you haven't seen it before, I know that they took it through a second printing, and I don't know if copies of that still survive.
Yeah, they have a new, they reprinted it within the last 5 years again.
Okay, so maybe a third printing.
Might even be fourth, I don't know.
Okay, right?
Yeah.
Well, it was doing this kind of work. Gazelle took pictures throughout Buffalo County. In fact, he originally started at Reed's Landing, so he loved the Mississippi River Valley. He loved Buffalo County, and so did I. I wasn't living in Alma when I was working as a director. I lived in Jaeger Valley. So in talking with Gary Schlossstein and others who weren't just tied to Muncie as a specific locus, I said, you know, why don't we see if we could create a county historical society that would then work with the Alma Historical Society. The Mondovi Area Historical Society started a year after we got Alma off the ground. After all, they were the metropolis of Buffalo County with 2,500 people. So if Alma was going to have it, they had to have one. And they had a lot of good people up there. They had the schoolhouse, so that came together. Gary Schlossstein, as I mentioned, was very interested in that, and without his input, it wouldn't have happened. I have this poster here. We did a lot of educational programming, which continues to be the case with the Society today. But one of my favorites was when I found out that Gary had a copy of this film that had been shot in 1939 by Howard Monk of Cochrane, who was somebody who bought a high-quality movie camera when only Hollywood people had things like this, and did this documentary on the 100th anniversary of when Holmes, was it Thomas, arrived at Holmes Landing, named after him in what is today Fountain City. A good steamer. Say again?
And it was in color.
It was in color, which was unheard of before World War II. So state of the art, and this was fascinating because some of the descendants of the native peoples, the Ho-Chunk, Winnebagos, that had been here when this was still Indian country, their relatives lived on in Black River Falls and the Wisconsin Dells area, and they were invited and they came down as a family and they did traditional dancing, captured on this film. There were floats. I mean, it was a really big deal, showing that before World War II, there was a heightened interest in local history that had sort of petered out after that. My point of view was that there was history retained in this county, but it was retained in families. It was not institutionalized. I wanted to create an alternative institution to individual archiving of the history, bring it together in a public place, and then, as they would say today, crowdsource it into existence by donations and volunteer efforts, and essentially that was where the idea for the Buffalo County Historical Society came. I found in my own personal archives, when I was researching to write this, a sign-up sheet that we had had at the 1980 Buffalo County Fair booth. And it says, sign up if you would be interested in the formation of a Buffalo County Historical Society. We had that at the Alma Historical Society booth. And 50 people signed up saying they were interested. So now we had a mailing list. And it went from there. We had our formational meeting on the autumnal equinox of 1980. So you'll notice, very close to the October date. At this point of time, we called for nominations from the floor for the board of directors. Gary was elected president and continued to serve in that capacity for many years. I don't know, are you still president?
Back again.
All right. At first they had to run through all the other talent, and now they're going back to, yeah. Shel Stromquist, who was then the director of the Wisconsin Historical Society's Office of Local History, he came up and gave us the spiel. Here's what we could do for you to help you get this off the ground, which is what led to us getting the incorporation so rapidly. We began selling charter memberships, and so you could say that by the late part of September, we came into existence. Now you'll notice this was in my files. The Statement of Purpose, Buffalo County Historical Society. Notice the date, September 29th, following that meeting by a week. Up at the top I wrote December 80 because we did some revisions, and that's the December 80 version. It was adopted, and some of the things that I'll pull out here was one of the statements of purpose: collect, preserve, and interpret the history of Buffalo County and its region. Not just tied to Alma. Alma's part of it. We'll let Alma do their part for what they're interested in, but we're going to take in a much bigger compass. We were also going to disseminate historical information and arouse interest in the past by holding educational meetings. Take a look around, 35 years later. Adopted major goals, among which hold regular membership meetings on topics of interest in different communities around the county. Here we are in the town of Waumandee. Reprint old, rare, valuable books, pamphlets, etc. for sale to the public. Well, you've got reprints here, and you've got new research, publications that wouldn't have existed before without having this vehicle for creating the audience, the interest, and bringing people out who would compile these histories. And then acquire and develop a facility for use as a Buffalo County Historical Research Center, which today resides on the second floor of the Buffalo County Courthouse. At that same meeting, it was decided to go after funds so we could hire somebody the way that Alma Historical Society had for the purpose of carrying out goals and purposes of the Buffalo County Historical Society. Part-time work, 3 days a week, salary $6,000 projected, plus travel. A minimum of 1 year commitment. We didn't want somebody to come in for 3 months and then flake out. I applied, was interviewed, and was hired, much to my surprise and delight. And I started then a week or two later in January of '81. Now what follows, I'm going to hit these kind of fast because I know that I don't want to engage your time on such a beautiful day to keep you indoors. But Kelly, I thought one thing that I could do to help give you a little bit better idea was to ask that he distribute my director's report that I found in my files from the year 1981. This is 4 of the 8 pages. I didn't include the news clippings that illustrate the things that are talked about in here. But if you're interested, I'm a professor, there's got to be handouts involved. And yes, there will be a quiz on this. But you can just take a glance at this. I felt like I had to take a nap after I finished reading this. I was exhausted by how much activity went on in a single year. And remember, this was at 60% of full time. And I was working here at the Little Bear Trading Company flour mill the other 2 days of the week, and serving as a substitute mail carrier on Saturdays down in Fountain City. So I could make a living through these various activities, and there was nobody that said I couldn't do it, so I did. I had Eleanor by my side, who has forever been an encourager, and she loves history as much as I do. So she actually went to these meetings with me, not because I had a gun to her head, but because she was interested. So we've always had a lot to share in. She worked as a Buffalo County Public Health nursing service, and was out in the country constantly with the old-timers as they were coming home from the hospital. And then she would come back, we'd have dinner at night, and she'd say, well, you've got to go out and see this fella out at the town of Modena, because he's got a big picture above the hearth in his farmhouse of when they plowed with draft horses, and he really wants to tell his story. So there it was. I would get on the phone, find out if there was a time to come out, and that's how the history got gathered, in this kind of random way. It helped that we had that persistence of the descendants of the original settlers, including Dwayne Berch in Fountain City, who was descended from one of the earliest people. I think his people got there a few years after Thomas Holmes in Fountain City. He's the County Board of Supervisors, what they called? Yes, so he was the chair of the county board, and Fountain City didn't have a historical society, so he thought this would be the way that Fountain City could be brought into some of the same success that we had been having at Alma. You saw the name there, maybe you didn't, Craig Halverson. Well, we're staying this weekend at the Waumandee House, former Waumandee Tavern, now a resort. And I was trying to remember, what did Craig Halverson do? He was in Waumandee. Well, he was called Yogi, and that was Yogi's place. So he was the barkeep there, prior to when they built those cabins and started lodging deer hunters and trout fishermen and the like. So we did try to get representation from all parts of the county. And as part of doing that, on the 4th of July 1981, we thought we would try to have a Founders Day celebration in each one of the communities that did not have a historical society, and then put the spotlight on that community. And we decided to settle on Buffalo City for our first one because most people did not know that that was formed as a colonization society of German immigrants from Cincinnati who rode a packet boat up looking for a good place to put a town, named it Buffalo City in the hopes that it would become the county seat of Buffalo County. And what was the problem is they came back on Pomme de Terre Slough in the spring of the year, when the boats could ply the waters, and there was enough water to get right up close to land. They said, this is what we want. They bought the tract of land, they plotted it out, you can see on this poster. And then the river dropped as it would, and you couldn't get a steamboat to Buffalo City most of the rest of the year, so it really didn't end up being the steamboat port that they had hoped, that Found City of Alma had become, so it never really grew to become what they had wanted. But notice here, Laverne Ripley, Laverne has done a book on Waumandee, which I just bought, I think that was the last copy. Professor of German Studies at St. Olaf. Gary did a presentation on Cochrane, which is where your family, was your dad and mom living there at that time still? And I did one on the Colonization Society. Now I didn't know anything about this, but I did all the standard research to try to put together a public presentation, just like I'm doing today. And that's a large amount of what I was doing when I was part of the Historical Society. We had meetings regularly, we brought in new blood. Kermit Cook was one of the old line families from Gilmanton area. I had known about his great-great-grandfather before I'd ever heard of him, because in doing research at the Wisconsin Historical Society, I found his Civil War letters home that were amazing, especially with comments that nobody down here seems to be fighting to free the slaves. I thought this was a war to free the slaves. Everyone talks about preserving the Union. There's no talk about slaves at all. Well, you know what? That's fascinating. Because when you study the history, they tell you, well, it was about freeing the slaves, and it certainly was. But what did the people that were actually out there doing the killing and trying to fight for some larger purpose, what did they think they were fighting for? That's the stories that we needed to get into the national story. So here's the case in point. Kermit was delighted to come onto the board. He contributed all kinds of things that were preserved in his family that now became part of the county story because there was a place to bring them together. Shelby, you're here. I put you down here because it was announced that you were going to coordinate the Buffalo County Cemetery Indexing Project, which of course, you know, has gone on, and I think most of the cemeteries finally did get indexed.
They're all done.
Most of them.
Sandra.
And you know, there are cemeteries that they're probably still finding that's in back properties that are grown over, and so genealogists are extremely interested. Where are our people buried? So we started a newsletter. The first one came out in spring of '82. You'll notice that banner head. Well, if you've been in the county courthouse, I'm assuming it's still there, where Gerhard Gazelle's Portraits of the Pioneers of Buffalo County, he did this sketch. So I took a picture of that because I can't draw. Those posters are pretty much sketch art. Brought that in. It's still being used in the newsletter today. That's kind of a kick. It's showing Indians leaving Holmes Landing as the settlers come in their steamboats. This first issue I read very carefully because I was curious, what did we have to say to the people of Buffalo County at a point now where we've got over 134 members. And I quoted Carl Sandburg, who's a poet that I met. He's from Galesburg, Illinois, where my dad grew up. I actually sat in his lap one time. He used to come over and play checkers with my grandfather. And in one of his poems, The People, yes, he wrote, "The past is a bucket of ashes." And you know what? To many people, that's what it is. And in fact, if you hang on to stuff too long, that's what it's going to become. Merida LeSueur was a poet who visited and stayed with us here in Jaeger Valley when we brought her for poetry readings. She was born in 1900. She told me once that the importance of local history was don't let them die without leaving an address. So that got my interest in doing oral history. Record the people's stories as they're telling them to you, because wouldn't you love to do that if you found, you know, an ancestor 5 generations removed, and in their own voice, they're telling you what their life meant to them, what they did, who they knew, what was the sweetness of their living. Well, one of the other things that we did that led to the Backroads tours that are now in their 30th year?
We did our 30th year.
30th year this year, was we decided to focus on the churches, since those unquestionably were the repositories of ancient knowledge. Often you found books there, sometimes in German language, that recorded who the people were who founded those places, and those records often stayed in these rural churches and nobody ever looked at them. So we thought, why don't we focus on these rural churches, get the congregations involved, and actually create a written history for them, and have a picnic to boot. Do it during the summertime when people want to be out and about looking around. So we did the first one at Lister, and that was because of Gary and Shelby saying, you know, you got to come out here and look at this place. The architecture inside was by a Norwegian woodworker, fine furniture maker, cabinet maker. What was his name? Do you remember?
Ole Mirren.
Ole Mirren, whose work is now in museums as an exquisite attainment of folk art, and his work is in a church. Who knew this? So we got the Norwegian part of the history, since so much of it's German, Swiss, and Polish. This was a way to bring our melting pot together here. But we also did one in Eagle Valley, because the Stetlers were very partial to this church. Kate Stetler was the director of the Historical Society who followed me. And then we also got this idea, you see now one of the latest books here, the writings by E.F. Gons. When we were doing the research in the Buffalo County newspaper, he had been, I think, the superintendent of the Waumandee schools, wasn't it? Or maybe he came to I've forgotten now.
He was a teacher in Waumandee.
Really good writer, avid local historian, did research, collected this, and then wrote popular history articles for the Alma paper, which I said, why don't we collect these into a book? Well, eventually they did. It just took 30-some years. But I discovered in there that he had written about the history of the Buffalo County Fair. Well, we're an agricultural county. That's the place we come together once a year to find out who's doing what. People get married because of people they met on rides at the Buffalo County Fair. It's a good feeling place. And we had some writings from Gons about this. And we noticed that, my gosh, you know, that's going to be the 110th anniversary coming up. Why don't we see if the Fair Board would give us some money to get this into print? We would pull all the previously published articles from the newspaper and collect it into this volume. And somewhere here I have a copy of it, but maybe they still have a few left because I think they've been selling them, trying to get rid of the last ones for quite a long time. So that became a kind of a kick to, again, link up something that had once been at Prague, once had been in Alma, had been in different locations, but most people never knew that it was any other place besides there in Mondovi. The next project was the last big one that I'm going to talk about. This had to do with the Mississippi River that unites both of the states in this part of the upper river. I went to a workshop. I went to dozens of workshops during the time that I was director. That's where I got my education on how to do oral history, how to build an archival collection, how to do genealogy, all of the skill sets that you need to be able to serve people in the way that a director of a local historical society should. And one of the things that I found out was that the National Endowment for the Humanities wanted more projects to be coming from the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin, but they didn't have as much money as they used to. And I got the idea that why didn't we ask both states, Minnesota and Wisconsin, to fund one project for one river valley? So I've been doing some reading. I discovered that you could find the same family names at Wabasha and Nelson, and at Winona and Fountain City. And the reason were that those bridges united people and found marriage partners on either side of the river, and their progeny stayed around. So we who live in the Mississippi River Valley live in a unified ecosystem, but the states are different. They have their own news media, and they think of themselves as existing with their Mississippi versus the other people's Mississippi. So the project was, let's focus on the river. And then secondly, who's done a history of the Mississippi River in the 20th century. Everything that was in print was about Huck Finn and steamboats and all the rest of it. It wasn't considered historical if it happened in the 20th century, so we thought, why not create a history of the river in the 20th century? That was the hook. We started out with 10 grand. That increased as the project got bigger than we'd originally planned. With Roger Locker, we did oral history interviews with some 40 people. Those are now archived at the Winona County Historical Society. That was the partnering organization. There's Roger. He just passed away a year and a half ago. David Kleist, and a photographer, Jane Roundhorse, who was a fine documentary photographer that we hired to create new images of the river today. Our selection criteria was you had to get wet regularly in the performance of your duties working on the Mississippi River, or we wouldn't interview you. So if you were in the National Fish and Wildlife Refuge office and you never left the office, we didn't interview you. But if you were out there working with the resource on a regular basis, we did. So all of those working histories, as far as I know, there's only 5 people still alive that we interviewed. All of the rest of them passed away. And the ones that passed away included the last 2 wooden-hulled steamboat pilots who lived in Fountain City. And their stories would have been extinguished had we not gone after them. I'll tell you how this fits into practical knowledge. I'm a mail carrier. I'm on Route 1 Fountain City. I'm up on Canada Ridge, and the winds are howling and the snow is falling, and I don't know where the road is anymore. And I can't turn around. And I've got the nation's mail in my car. Well, I had remembered that Walter Carneth had told me, when I asked him, you plied the waters of the Mississippi River without electric lights at night? When there wasn't even a full moon? How did you navigate? And he told me, well, acoustically, you would listen for the lap, lap, lap sound on the wooden hull, and you could tell the difference between shallow water and deep. Who would know that? And then secondly, there is light at night. Your eyes have to get used to it. It's infrared. And you can make out when there are tips of plants at the surface of the water. And then you know you're getting shallow. So here I am on Canada Ridge. The ditches have filled in with snow. I can't even see if there's any mailboxes out there. I don't know where the road is. But then I remembered, maybe I could see the tips of some weeds, and that would tell me where the ditches were. And lo and behold, there were. So I made it off of Canada Ridge, in large part because Walter Carneth told me how he navigated wood-hulled steamboats in the 1930s on the Mississippi River. This is me interviewing the cousin of Marvin Blank, from whom we bought Jaeger Valley Farm. We are aboard the Dredge Thompson, interviewing Lee, who is himself the engineer. And this was a difficult interview to do because, as you know, engines are really loud when they're dredging. And that's poor audio quality. So we got as far away from the engine as we could for me to record this interview. I wanted to record where the work was being done, because I thought the smells and the sounds would bring more deep memories into the interview. And it certainly was the case. And they're still dredging across from Reed's Landing. You know, that's where the Chippewa River comes down and throws its plume of sand across and backs up Lake Pepin. This was the project then. We built a traveling exhibit with over 100 images, most of them historical, some of them not having seen before in 50 years. Case in point, Lock and Dam number 4. Went up there to interview the lockmaster. He said, you know what? I think there is a storage locker in a back room that has photographs of the construction of Lock and Dam 4 in the 1930s. I said, could you check? Let's go right now. And he went back there. 15 minutes later, we pulled out this huge locker, opened it up, and there were photographs that had not been seen since the 1930s that documented practically every 15 minutes of change over the couple of years that they built that dam. Imagine this. They stopped the mighty Mississippi and they put a dam across it, and it's still there. That took a lot of effort, a lot of engineering smarts, and it was one of the reasons why Buffalo County had not been hurt by the Great Depression the way that other towns did that didn't have this massive federal employment. And not only that, but some of the people that came here to work stayed. So it helped us with our gene pool, that we got a whole bunch of other outsiders in here that became pillars of our community. Well, this was a two-part affair. We had a traveling exhibit that we took to 6 river towns. We had a 42-minute AV program. I'm not calling it a documentary video because it wasn't a video. They weren't doing videos. It was slide tape. My brother worked in television in the Twin Cities. We mixed it up there, brought it down here. The quality was good enough. It was broadcast over 6 television stations, even though it didn't have moving images. And it was broadcast over 12 radio stations, the audio track of it. Our purpose, and this is where the humanities part came in, was to engage people in a social change, environmental activism thing that was part of stopping the Tyrone nuclear plant, which I must mention, we did stop. It happened that the final hearing occurred when the 3 Mile Island plant blew in Pennsylvania. And at that point, the Public Utility Commission said, we got to put a stop to any more of these until we can figure out what went wrong. And there has not been a nuclear power plant built in the United States since 3 Mile Island. Had it been built, cost overruns probably 3 times of what it would have been projected. That was the norm. And instead, we hired a company that came in and made the case to the Public Utility Commission that if they spent a mere fraction, I think it was 0.1% of what was projected to build that plant, on conservation efforts, that we would tell the utility companies they would have to carry out for conservation. We could save far more energy than would have been produced by the plant and have no nuclear waste problem. And in fact, that plant wasn't built, and the Public Utilities Commission did put that plan into effect, and free conservation methods went out from the utilities throughout the entire state. So, from the taxpayers of Wisconsin, you're welcome. When this went out, what we wanted to do was to stop another project. It was called the 12-foot channel project. The Army Corps of Engineers wanted to bring ocean-going vessels all the way to the head of navigation at the Ford Dam in Minneapolis-St. Paul. That meant dredging the channel from the current 9-foot to 12, taking 3 more feet out. And when that happened, all of the heavy metals, PCBs, that had been entrapped in the sediment and were now encased at the bottom of the river, where they'll probably sit forever, would have been churned up and put in suspension and sent downstream to every little town, including Winona, that gets part of its water from the Mississippi River. So, not only would we have big ocean-going vessels, we would have had to reconstruct all 26 locks and dams to accommodate these boats, and the impact on the natural world that rely on this biotic paradise and on recreation would have been extraordinary. So by bringing the history of the river to the people in 6 river towns, La Crosse to Red Wing, ultimately up to St. Paul and to Madison as well, we then brought humanities scholars in contact with the general public to create conversations about the value of the natural environment and how we make our livings based upon it, ideally in a sustainable fashion, so that our great-grandchildren themselves could have some of the same experiences that we enjoy. And one of them, I remember, was a philosopher from St. Mary's then College in Winona, who was at the Alma talk, and he started out his talk with the audience by saying, do animals have civil rights? Do they have the right to life? Who speaks for the natural world? It was profound, and it was a room full of commercial fishermen. Max Bachhuber, the fishing float, was there. There were people that were associated with the Corps, and they're listening intently, and they're thinking, we're animals. And we seem to think that we're on top of the chain and we can command creation any which way we want. We don't have the time depth to think about this, nor do we think of ourselves as part of a biotic community. So history became the hook to do that. Countercultural. And so I end my talk. You know that I lived a life in the counterculture. It has shaped who I am. I teach the 60s in a university today, and I can be both a subject and an object because I can draw on first-person accounts, but then I also present multiple viewpoints as you need to do. There isn't one version of the story. I focus on the communitarianism aspect because that has fallen away. The reason why we wanted to form an intentional community was because we thought we would be better human beings together. That the spiritual relationship of telling the truth to one another and trying to help one another be better human beings in all of the richness that that suggests, that would be a good thing to do. And it's hard to do when you're living in your little isolated houses and driving to your job and coming home and playing with your kids, and that's what you do. We wanted to form a community intentionally that would draw out the best of us and help us work on those things that every one of us has, those problems that are so difficult to confront alone. The counterculture was part of, for me, looking past politics that was divisive, especially in the 60s. There was an exhaustion from how much strife there was. You were trying to stop crazy things like the Vietnam War. You were trying to build a better society. It was tough. I wanted to find a way that we could move past what we didn't have in common and work from the basis of what we had in common. That was countercultural. I wanted to look to the past, as people have done in other periods of social strife, to find strength and ideas and inspiration for how we might learn from that and create a better society in the present and the future. So for me, the Alma Historical Society and the Buffalo County Historical Society were alternative institutions. Mike Wallace, who was one of the founders of what is today called public history, referring to all the places you run into history outside of a school setting. So like here, this is public and it's history. He once said that Americans are historicidal. We kill history. We knock down buildings that become the temples of memory, and we wipe out the associations that go with it. Perfectly good buildings. Why? Because this country was founded on the quest for a better future. We are a future-oriented people. The past gets in the way. So, the historical societies are alternative institutions because they counter this misguided notion that the past is an obstacle to the present and the better future. I did not know when I spent my time doing this work that it was going to lead to a life that led me out of Buffalo County. I probably wouldn't have pursued it if I had known. We bought this farm, we thought we'd live out the rest of our days here. But as it turned out, married 35 years ago tomorrow, just in the other side of the valley, that my mail carrying days were not going to be forever. In fact, I was at the point when the Working on the River exhibit went up to the Minnesota Historical Society. They asked me to apply for a job doing exhibits for them. And I thought, wow, why not do that? So I applied. The person that asked me to do this was the one who invited me to bring the Working on the River exhibit up. He said, I already have your resume. It's right outside my office. So I filled out the application form. He called me up and he said, well, when it got to where you earned your degree, you wrote the School of Hard Knocks. I've never heard of that. And I said, well, it's a figure of speech. I never went to college. Oh, baloney. Where did you go to college? I never went to college. You've been doing all this with a high school education? I said, yeah, nobody said I couldn't. So it led to the realization that if I really did want to make a living, not $6,000 a year, but maybe something that could support a family, and not traveling around on a mail route, which would be a great job for somebody besides me, boy, who wouldn't kill to have a job like that? But maybe I should be a cultural worker full-time and make a living at it. That led me to go to college at the age of 32. That was all I was going to do, is just get that entry-level credential, maybe come back here. Ended up getting a graduate fellowship to an Ivy League university, Cornell. We moved out there. 7 years later, master's and PhD in hand, I got a job as a college professor. It was not part of my life plan. But the job I got hired for that I have today, 20 years later, I got because of the work I did here in Buffalo County. I am the public historian. I have hundreds of students who now do what I did, and I can show them how. And they do it for college credit, and their tuition pays my salary. So that's how that went. But I'm here to thank you because I couldn't have done this by myself. You can't be a public historian of one. It takes a public. And that was what you were for me. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you.